I'm Violet Aldridge, 78 years old, and as I stood beneath the black awning over my husband's grave, the rain soaked through my coat and my shoes. But I didn't flinch. I just kept looking at the simple plaque they'd placed in the wet earth. Howard Aldridge, loving husband and father, 1943 to 2024. 59 years of life together condensed into one flat sentence. Calder. My only son stood beside me, and though his hand was on my arm, his touch felt as distant as his eyes. Behind me. I heard my daughter-in-law Paisley urging me to come inside, that the guests were waiting at our house. But her voice had no warmth in it. Just hurry and calculation. I nodded eventually, but as we drove back to the house Howard and I had shared for 30 years, I couldn't shake the cold feeling in my chest that something had shifted, and not just the loss. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to fight for your own home and dignity. Howard and I moved to Worcester, Massachusetts when Calder was just starting elementary school. We had left behind the noise and pressure of Boston trading. Busy streets for quiet evenings and a house that Howard fixed up with his own two hands. It was an old Victorian thing, a bit too big for just us three, but we filled it with years of love and laughter, or at least we tried. Howard was practical, even romantic when no one was watching. And I worked steady jobs over the years, first as an accountant, then later part-time, just to stay busy. Calder always had his own mind. Even as a boy, smart, quiet, ambitious, but distant. He was the kind of child who asked hard questions and rarely offered hugs by the time he was in high school. He called our town a hole and made it clear he'd leave as soon as he could. And he did, went to college in Boston, then married Paisley, a real estate agent with sharp eyes and a colder smile. They visited only when Howard asked them to and never stayed. Long, still, Howard tried to bridge the distance, tried to nudge Calder into warmth. But whatever had formed between them over the years had hardened like cement. And now, with Howard gone, there was nothing left to smooth it over. The afternoon of the funeral, people filled the house. Neighbors, old co-workers, even a few distant cousins. I sat in the armchair by the fireplace, the one Howard used to nap in reading his newspaper, and for a brief second, I could still feel the shape of him there. Paisley flitted around, offering drinks, straightening things as if it were a cocktail party. Her black dress too crisp, her voice too bright. Calder brought me tea. Asked if I was okay, I said. Your father is dead. He nodded like he was checking off a list of expected answers. He mentioned, we'd need to talk soon about the will, about the house, about practical matters. But I asked him, not today. Please, not today. That night was the first I spent alone in our bedroom without Howard. The pillow still held the shape of his head. His robe still hung on the hook by the bathroom door. The book he never finished lay open on the nightstand. I sat there in silence for a long time, remembering the university dance, where we met the proposal in the rain, his laugh when Calder took his first steps. Then I heard voices downstairs, muffled arguing, Calder and Paisley, their tones sharp, then hushed. My chest tightened. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I knew whatever it was had nothing to do with grief or missing Howard. In the morning, I came downstairs, and just as I reached the last step, I heard Paisley's voice say, we need to move faster. Who knows what's in this new will? And Calder responded quiet. She might hear. I stood frozen, then took a slow breath and stepped into the kitchen, pretending I'd heard nothing. Whatever was in that will, Howard had made it for a reason, and I had to find it before they did. I sat on the porch that morning, wrapped in the old plaid blanket my mother had made for me years ago, the one that still smelled faintly of cedar and wood smoke from the fireplace. Calder and Paisley had come by again, this time without calling. They brought groceries, and Calder said he wanted to check the garage roof. I hadn't said anything about a leak, but he insisted anyway. Paisley said it was just concern. They were trying to help out, that I looked tired, thinner than usual, and should start thinking about practical matters. But her smile didn't match her words. Not really. Not in the way it should have. They stayed longer than usual that day. Calder poked around the garage. Paisley read a magazine in the living room, though she kept glancing around at the furniture, like she was mentally appraising each piece. I kept my voice steady, offered them tea, and thanked them for the groceries. But inside, I was watching every move, trying to see through what they weren't saying. When they finally left just before sundown, I waited at the window until their car turned the corner. Only then did I exhale. The next morning, I drove to the lake cabin with Elizabeth. She'd offered to come along, and I was grateful to have her with me. We hadn't been to the cottage since before Howard's diagnosis. The place sat on a quiet slope overlooking the water. 2 small bedrooms, a porch wrapped in vines, a little dock where Howard used to sit and fish for hours. We opened windows to air the place out, and then started searching. I went through Howard's desk, opened every drawer, checked every folder and envelope. I even looked behind the painting he'd hung above the fireplace. But the safe only held old paperwork, a little cash, and some jewelry. The will wasn't there. We spent the afternoon going room by room, checking books and boxes and side tables in the kitchen. We emptied drawers one by one. Nothing matched what I was looking for. Eventually, we sat on the porch with sandwiches Elizabeth had packed. She poured us each a glass of wine, said, "Maybe it was a blessing. We hadn't found anything yet." She thought I needed time to prepare to protect myself from what she called Calder's intentions. Her voice was gentle but firm. She told me to talk to Arthur again, to ask what could be done if the new will never surfaced, to write down everything that felt off, and to consider moving some assets into my own name, just in case. When I got home that evening, the house felt heavier than usual, as if something had shifted in the air. I stayed up late, sitting in Howard's chair, staring into the unlit fireplace and thinking. The next day, I called Arthur and made an appointment. I didn't tell Calder or Paisley. They didn't need to know. But by then, they had started showing up more often, 2 or 3 times a week. Sometimes with groceries, sometimes with questions, always uninvited. Calder wandered through the house pretending to inspect pipes or outlets. Paisley would straighten the throw pillows or rearrange things in the pantry. It was always under the guise of helping, of looking out for me. But the timing, the frequency, it all felt too coordinated. One morning, while folding laundry, I overheard Calder outside my door telling Paisley he needed to speed things up. "Who knows what's in that new will?" she'd said again, her voice tight with impatience. Calder hushed her quickly, but the words stuck with me. I had no proof, not yet, but something was wrong, and I needed to act fast. Arthur confirmed what I'd feared. Howard had taken the draft of the new will home with him 2 weeks before he died, but never brought it back to be finalized, Arthur said. If Howard had signed it in front of witnesses, it could still be legally valid, even without formal filing. He told me to think hard about where Howard might have hidden. It was likely somewhere personal, somewhere meaningful to us both. I turned the house upside down, checking drawers, bookshelves, the old sewing cabinet in the hallway, even inside the piano bench where we kept sheet music. Still nothing. The safety deposit box held only old documents and family keepsakes, and though I knew Howard was a creature of habit who liked to keep things close, it felt like I was missing something. Something right in front of me that weekend. Calder called and said they'd be coming to stay for a few days. He said they wanted to help go through Howard's things, help sort and clean and move forward. I told him I wasn't ready, and he reminded me it had already been a month. "You can't live in the past forever, Mom," he said. But the way he said it made it sound less like a comfort and more like a warning. That evening, I went back to the attic, climbed the creaky stairs, and searched again. Boxes of Calder's childhood toys, old photo albums, blankets we hadn't used in decades. I opened every drawer in Howard's old desk again. Still nothing, and then sitting on the edge of an old trunk, it hit me. The lake house again, not the desk, not the safe, something we hadn't considered. Maybe Howard hid it somewhere even more personal. I woke early the next morning and drove there alone. I told Elizabeth I needed space time to think on the drive. The rain started falling in steady drops. The road blurred as the wipers swept back and forth. I passed the same old signs, the same trees we used to count on our way up. Howard loved those trips. He'd always said the lake air cleared his mind. Once there, I searched again, retracing every step. This time, I paid more attention to the things Howard had loved: the spot by the fireplace, the shed near the dock, even the floorboards near the bed. I tapped walls, ran my fingers over shelves, opened every fishing box. Nothing. The sun was starting to drop toward the water, and I was nearly ready to give up when I thought of the dock itself. I walked slowly down to the water. The wood planks creaked under my feet, soft and swollen from the rain. At the end was a small storage box where Howard kept lures and spare tackle. I opened it carefully, but it held only rusted hooks and fishing line. No hidden papers, no envelope, no trace of what I was chasing. The drive back to Worcester felt longer than usual. I gripped the wheel and tried to steady my breathing. The streetlights flicked on one by one as I pulled into the driveway. Calder's car was already there. Lights on inside the house, but the living room was dark as I stepped through the back door. I heard them in the next room talking softly. Then I heard my name. Violet's becoming a problem. Paisley said, "What if she finds it?" Calder told her. "Not to worry." Said the will wasn't signed. Said, even if it was, they could challenge it. Say Howard was confused on painkillers, and if that didn't work, they'd take another route. He said, they'd start creating a case that I was no longer able to care for myself. Mentioned talking to Dr. Prescott, said a few falls and memory slips would be enough to get me declared incompetent. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I stood in that dark hallway holding my breath as they planned every step, every lie, every betrayal. When I finally slipped back outside, I didn't go to Elizabeth's. I drove straight toward the train station with no real plan, only fear and instinct. I stopped at an ATM, pulled out $500, and walked into the station. The last train to New York was leaving in 30 minutes. I stood at the counter, ready to buy a ticket, and paused, my hand hovering over my wallet. I heard Howard's voice in my head, the words he'd said before he passed. "Violet, remember the will? Everything will be all right." I stepped back from the counter and sat on a bench, staring at the schedule board. Running wouldn't fix anything. Not now. Not like this. They'd call me unstable, say. I wandered off, proved their point. I couldn't give them that. I had to go back, not as a victim, but prepared. I'd find the will, and I'd get proof of what they were planning, and if I was going to play their game, I'd do it on my own terms. The next morning, I returned to the house just before sunrise. The streets were still quiet, the porch lights still on. Calder and Paisley were asleep upstairs. I slipped through the kitchen door, careful not to wake them, and poured myself a glass of water. My hands trembled just slightly enough that I had to steady them on the edge of the sink. I knew too much now, and the weight of it made every corner of the house feel unfamiliar. At breakfast, Paisley commented on how tired I looked. Said maybe I should schedule a checkup. Calder offered to make the call, said it was just to be safe. I smiled, thanked them, and said I'd think about it. Then went back to my room, closed the door, and called Arthur. I told him everything I'd overheard, every detail, word for word. He didn't interrupt. Once, just listened, and when I finished, he told me we needed a plan. We met the next afternoon in his office. The space was quiet, with deep carpets and bookshelves lined with legal volumes. He poured me tea and said that if we couldn't find the will, we'd need to protect me another way. He explained that declaring someone incompetent wasn't as easy as Calder seemed to think. There were evaluations and court hearings and medical records. But he also warned me that if Calder had already spoken to Dr. Prescott, that could complicate things. Arthur leaned forward, said it softly. If they think they're winning, they'll be less careful. He suggested that I let them believe their plan was working just enough to make them speak freely. He gave me a small device, a keychain that doubled as a voice recorder, told me to keep it with me at all times and to document everything from here on out. When I got back home, Calder was in the den. Paisley was watching TV. I told them I'd gone for a walk and lost track of time. Calder looked up, asked if I'd called the doctor yet. I blinked, acted unsure, and said, "No, not yet. Maybe tomorrow?" He smiled, told me he'd call on my behalf the next few days. I began acting forgetful. Just small things, misplacing keys, repeating myself, mixing up names. I put the sugar canister in the fridge and salt in the pantry, Paisley said. She was worried, and Calder mentioned Dr. Prescott again. I nodded. Let them schedule the appointment, and every time they brought it up, I acted confused or distracted just enough to keep their confidence growing. Each night, I listened to the recording from the keychain. The microphone picked up more than I expected. Their conversations in the hallway, their phone calls in the kitchen. They talked freely when they thought I was napping or asleep. Paisley asked if I'd signed anything lately, and Calder told her not yet. But soon, one more push, and they'd have what they needed. I kept searching the house when they were out. Looked in drawers behind books, even inside Howard's old coat pockets. But the will was nowhere. I couldn't stop wondering where he might have hidden it, or if he ever signed it at all. Each night, I went to bed with that same question echoing in my mind on Sunday morning. Paisley made breakfast, said they'd be staying a few more days. I smiled and thanked her, then went upstairs and called Elizabeth. I asked if she could come by after lunch, said I just needed someone familiar around. She showed up with her usual energy, holding a pie and a newspaper. We sat on the back porch while Calder worked in the garage, and Paisley swept the hallway. For the third time that morning, I told Elizabeth what was happening. Not all of it, just enough that she knew something wasn't right. She reached across the table, took my hand, and said she trusted me, said Howard. Did too. Said, if there was a will somewhere, then he'd made sure I would find it when I needed it most. That evening, I looked through the old record cabinet in the living room. Howard loved music. He had a collection of vinyl records, alphabetized and dusted with care. Some he played often, others only on special occasions. One stood out, a record he'd given me on our last anniversary. A compilation of old love songs from the 50s tucked in the back of the cabinet on a lower shelf. I opened the sleeve and ran my fingers inside. Nothing, just the record, but the memory of him giving it to me played again in my mind. He'd said these songs, tell our story, Violet, when I'm gone. Let them remind you that I'll always love you. The next morning, I tried again this time, going back through our bedroom. His side of the closet still smelled faintly of his cologne. I checked the drawers again, ran my hand along the top shelf, and found nothing but dust back in the kitchen. Found Calder going through the mail. Said he was organizing things for me. I nodded and turned away before he saw my hands shaking after lunch. Paisley asked if I'd considered assisted living. Said it might be nice to have structure and safety. Calder said they could start looking into places for me, maybe take a tour next week. I smiled, told them I'd think about it, but that night after they'd gone to bed, I pulled the recorder from my purse and whispered into it. May 15th, 2024. Violet Aldridge, documenting the events in my home. My son and daughter-in-law are making efforts to remove me from the property and declare me unfit. Their plan involves Dr. Prescott and staged incidents. I am acting as if unaware, but I am fully aware. I am searching for my late husband's will and believe it exists and will be found soon. I hid the recorder under the lining of my purse and started writing notes in a small notebook labeled grocery lists. Things I needed to remember. I wrote down every odd look, every suggestion, every question they asked me about the house. I wrote in small print, careful and quiet, each night. I locked the notebook in my bedside table just in case. 3 days later, the appointment with Dr. Prescott arrived. Calder drove me. Paisley stayed behind. I answered the questions, slowly answered some wrong on purpose, forgot simple words, mixed up names at the end of the exam. Dr. Prescott said he'd call with results. But Calder looked satisfied on the way home. He said he'd handle the next steps, said everything was falling into place. I thanked him, said he was a good son, then stared out the window as we drove past the hardware store. Howard used to love. I remembered how he'd always told me to trust my instincts, that the truth was rarely hidden where people expected it to be. That night, I sat in the den, staring at the record shelves again, the same collection I'd flipped through a dozen times. I reached for that same album from our last anniversary, pulled the record. Halfway out, then paused. The sleeve felt thicker than the others. I tipped it, and out slid a folded sheet of paper with our lawyer's letterhead across the top. I sat down, slowly unfolded the paper, and stared at Howard's signature near the bottom and 2 others below it, Noah and Elizabeth Brooks. It was dated 2 weeks before Howard died, the ink still crisp, the corners clean. I placed the will back inside the sleeve and tucked the record behind 3 others. Paisley wouldn't think to check. Then I walked upstairs, climbed into bed, and stared at the ceiling as calm settled in for the first time in weeks. Tomorrow, I would call Arthur and tell him what I found the next morning. I woke early before Calder or Paisley had come downstairs. I made coffee and sat quietly at the kitchen table. The will was folded neatly in my purse, tucked beside the keychain recorder Arthur had given me. I thought about calling him right away, but something told me to wait until Calder left the house. He never stayed gone. For long these days, always circling never far. When I heard the upstairs shower start, I dialed Arthur's number from the wall phone. His voice came through steady and clear. He listened carefully as I told him. I'd found the will, confirmed the signatures, and read the contents. I told him. The date matched exactly 2 weeks before Howard passed, and that both Noah and Elizabeth had signed it as witnesses. Arthur said he'd draft a formal plan. He wanted to verify the document and prepare the legal process to validate it in full. He also said we'd need to handle the confrontation carefully. Timing would matter. I think it's time for you to start acting, he said. We have the truth now, but we'll need proof that they were willing to take everything from you before they knew the will existed. He told me to keep the pretense going a few more days, just until we had everything we needed. You're in control now, Violet, even if they don't know it yet. I hung up the phone just as Calder came down the stairs. He asked if I'd slept well. I told him I'd had strange dreams. He smiled, told me not to worry, said they'd take care of everything. He and Paisley were planning to stay through the weekend, maybe longer. They wanted to help organize Howard's things. He said it gently, as if it were a favor by Saturday afternoon. I was back to leaving small clues for them to follow: sugar in the spice rack, mixing up the laundry labels, misplacing the remote in the freezer. I said I was distracted. Calder offered to call Dr. Prescott again. Paisley brought up assisted living homes this time with brochures. I nodded. Said I'd look them over later. Elizabeth stopped by with muffins and a fresh pot of soup. She could tell something had changed in me, but didn't ask. We sat in the backyard beneath the old maple tree. I showed her the notebook where I'd been keeping records, dates, times. Strange comments, overheard phone calls made from the landline. She nodded. Said we were getting close and that Howard would be proud of how steady I'd stayed. Through it all the next day, Paisley caught me staring out the window. She asked what I was thinking about. I told her I was missing Howard. That the house felt too big sometimes. That maybe it was time to start making decisions. Calder brought up the idea of downsizing again. He said, there was no rush. but that we should begin talking about options. I smiled, folded the brochures into a drawer, and said, "We'd talk Monday later that night after they'd gone to bed." I pulled out the will again, read it word by word, just to be sure Howard had left me full control of the house and all our financial accounts. Calder would receive the lake, cottage, and a modest inheritance, but only after my passing. The terms were clear. There was no mistake. I recorded a short message into the keychain describing the contents, the date, and that I was fully aware of my surroundings and mental state. Monday morning arrived, bright and breezy. I made breakfast slowly, let my hands shake a little more than usual, salted my tea instead of sugaring it. Paisley looked concerned. Calder offered to drive me to Dr. Prescott again for a follow-up. I told him I didn't think it was necessary. He insisted, and I nodded softly as if too tired to argue. Once we were in the car, I shifted my tone just slightly enough for Calder to notice. I said I'd remembered something important. I'd found a paper of Howard's in an envelope tucked inside an old book. Something that looked official. Calder's knuckles tightened around the steering wheel. I told him it might be the will and that I'd called Arthur to check if it meant anything. He didn't say much after that, just stared ahead. Until we reached the clinic, Dr. Prescott greeted us with his usual polished calm. He asked me how I'd been feeling, ran through the usual memory tests. This time, I let myself answer almost everything correctly, but still stumbled over the date and the name of our neighbor's cat, just enough to keep their confidence up outside the clinic. Calder said, "We should stop by Arthur's office since we were already out." I told him I'd like that and that we should call Paisley to join us. I said, the will probably needed witnesses anyway. He agreed, but I could tell he was uneasy at Arthur's office. The receptionist led us into the conference room where Arthur and a quiet man with a notary badge were already waiting. The will was on the table sealed in a clear protective folder. Arthur greeted us like it was just a casual meeting, but I saw the weight in his expression. Calder sat down slowly. Paisley arrived a few minutes later, hair neat, eyes sharp. She didn't greet me. She just nodded at Arthur and took the chair beside her husband. Arthur opened the meeting by confirming the document and its legal standing. He read each line aloud clearly and without pause. As he read, Calder's expression stayed neutral. But Paisley's fingers tightened around her purse strap when Arthur reached the clause outlining that the estate would remain in my control until my death. Calder leaned back in his chair and looked toward the ceiling. "How do we know this isn't forged?" Paisley asked quietly. "How do we know Howard was of sound mind?" Arthur calmly stated that the witnesses had already been contacted and confirmed Howard's clarity and intent at the time of signing. He also mentioned that medical records had been reviewed by an outside specialist not affiliated with Dr. Prescott, and all were consistent with legal standards. Paisley turned to Calder, said something too low to hear, and that's when I reached into my purse and placed the keychain on the table. I asked Arthur to press play and let the room fill with the recording voices came through clear. "My name." Calder's tone. Paisley's questions. Every word of their late-night conversation about staged accidents and sleeping pills was right there in the open. No one spoke for a long moment. Then Arthur turned off the device, looked across the table and said, "We had everything we needed, but that he'd give them one opportunity to settle matters privately. If they agreed to walk away from contesting the will and leave me in peace, we would not pursue charges." Calder didn't argue. Paisley looked toward the door. We drew up the paperwork then and there. The notary stamped each page as we signed one after the other. Calder signed. Last jaw tight, shoulders hunched. He didn't look at me as he passed the folder back to Arthur. When it was over, I stood quietly and turned to Calder. One last time. I said only that I wished him well, and that I hoped someday he would remember the man Howard truly was, not the money he left behind. As we stepped out into the sun, I felt something lift. I wasn't sure what came next, but I knew I'd taken the first true step toward it. The following week, I moved through the house differently, not out of fear, but with a quiet clarity. Each drawer I opened, each photo I passed, reminded me this was my home, still mine, not just in memory, but in name. Elizabeth came by with a small basket of pears and a paper sack full of envelopes she'd gathered from her own files. Things from her father's estate she thought might help a few of them were old letters from Howard's lawyer and a couple of bank statements showing account transfers dated long before his decline. One stood out, a check made out to Calder, a large one from nearly 2 years ago when Howard was still healthy and fully alert. I tucked it away in my folder, not because it proved anything criminal, but because it proved something personal. Howard had been trying to help him without letting me know. I spent most of my time that week meeting with Arthur, organizing paperwork, scanning documents into the desktop in the den. He encouraged me to take small steps, not just toward legal closure, but emotional as well. I started with the dining room, replaced the chairs Paisley had ordered with the ones Howard had refinished by hand. They weren't modern or sleek, but they felt right. Arthur called one afternoon to say the judge had accepted the will's registration. The final validation was complete. We were done, legally speaking. Calder and Paisley had signed the agreement to withdraw any contestation they'd left town the day after the meeting without so much as a note left behind. The house was quiet again. I could hear the clock ticking on the mantel, hear the dishwasher hum. I hadn't realized how loud they'd been until the silence settled. I opened the garage for the first time in weeks. Howard's workbench still smelled faintly of cedar and motor oil. I stood there for a while, just breathing it in, touching the old vice grip he'd mounted decades ago, his handwriting still marked on the labels above the tool racks. Elizabeth stopped by again the next day with a book of recipes her mother had handwritten. She remembered. I liked molasses, cookies, she said, and thought this one might bring me a little warmth. I thanked her and sat on the porch with a cup of tea, flipping through the yellowed pages. Each note, each stain felt like a small invitation to remember. On Sunday, I walked to church alone. For the first time in a while, people greeted me kindly. Some offered condolences. Others simply hugged me. Reverend Daniels paused his sermon to mention Howard's name, not with sorrow, but with gentle reverence, said he'd been a quiet steward of grace. I sat 2 rows from the front and let the words sink in afterward. Mrs. Stanford stopped me in the parking lot, said she'd heard about the will and the fallout and wanted to tell me something. She'd once overheard Calder talking with the bank about refinancing our home years ago before Howard's illness. I didn't press her for details, just listened, thanked her, and watched her walk away slowly across the lot, cane tapping lightly on the pavement. That night, I sat with the old photo album Howard had kept in the bottom drawer of his nightstand. Snapshots of vacations, birthdays. Even just evenings on the back porch, I found one of Calder when he was no more than 6, kneeling in the dirt next to Howard, planting a row of spring onions. The date was scribbled in the corner in my handwriting. April 1989. I slipped the photo into a small silver frame, placed it on the bookshelf beside the fireplace. It reminded me that things hadn't always been like this, and that not everything lost had been taken on Monday. I baked for the first time in months. I used Mrs. Hanley's biscuit recipe, the one I'd memorized back in the 70s, with too much lard and just enough love. The house smelled like it used to, warm, full of flour and memory. Elizabeth dropped by around noon, and we sat at the table splitting biscuits over peach preserves and shared silence. She said she'd been thinking about taking a trip to the mountains and asked if I might want to come along just a few days. No pressure. I told her I'd think about it, maybe after the garden got one more round of pruning as she left. She turned and said, "You did more than hold on. Violet, you waited them out and you won." Without shouting. I didn't reply. I just smiled and closed the door softly behind her. Later that night, I made a list of things I'd like to do before winter: repaint the hallway, write to my cousin in Vermont, replaced the porch swing cushions. It was the first time in a long while I made a list for myself. Not for Calder, not for Howard, just for me. And as the sun dipped low behind the maple tree out back, I sat in Howard's old recliner with my feet tucked beneath me and listened to the wind tap against the windows. The same wind that had always come through this house year after year, season after season, now whispering something quieter, something mine. Under the quiet of that week I made it a habit to open just one drawer or one cabinet each morning, not to clean or organize, but to rediscover what had been tucked away. Things that once mattered before the house grew so loud one morning in the hall closet. I found Howard's old leather portfolio, the one he'd used before retirement. Still smelled faintly of pipe tobacco inside were a few old receipts, some legal pads, and a slim notebook I'd never seen before. It wasn't locked, but the leather clasp had stiffened with time. I eased it open and flipped through carefully. What I found wasn't a diary. Not quite, but it was personal. Little notes written to himself. Grocery lists mixed with thoughts about the house, future repairs, things he wanted to teach Calder before he passed. Some entries were dated in his last year, others much earlier. But there was one near the back that made me pause. He'd written about a conversation he'd overheard Calder having with someone named Marcus. The note said, "If he goes through with it, I'll have to call Arthur. No matter what Violet says, protect the house. Protect her." The handwriting was shaky, but clear. The date placed it 8 months before Howard's final hospital stay. I took the notebook straight to Arthur. He read the page 3 times before sitting back slowly. Then he said, "The name Marcus wasn't familiar, but it could be a banker, a realtor, or someone involved in a financial scheme. Possibly Calder had been making moves behind our backs long before Howard fell ill." Arthur promised to follow up discreetly. Check court filings, property transfers, old power of attorney documents. He said it might be nothing, or it might explain a great deal. He also asked if I'd be willing to give a formal statement if it came to that. I nodded on my way home. I stopped by the bakery and picked up 2 apple turnovers. Mrs. Hanley always said, if you were going to face down trouble, do it with something sweet in your pocket. As the week passed, I started spending more time in Howard's workshop in the garage. It wasn't just grief pulling me there, it was grounding. I polished the vice grip, tightened a few drawer handles. I even sanded one of the smaller stools we'd used for potting plants years ago. Then one afternoon, Elizabeth dropped by again, this time holding a stack of mail and a puzzled look she'd gotten a letter addressed to Howard delivered to her, by mistake. It was from a company neither of us recognized, but the return address matched the town where Calder had briefly lived after college. Inside was a statement, a bank account summary dated 5 years ago. The account was in Howard's name, but listed Calder as a joint holder, and the withdrawals had been steady, thousands at a time over 2 years, ending abruptly the same month Howard was hospitalized. I called Arthur immediately. He asked if I could bring it in. That day I did, and he scanned it into his system, told me it was the clearest evidence so far that Calder had been draining Howard's assets long before any decline in cognition could be blamed. It wasn't just about the money. Not anymore. It was about the pattern, the trust broken piece by piece, slowly, quietly, until what remained was only enough for anger to take root. Arthur filed a formal motion to request Calder's financial records, under suspicion of elder financial abuse, not to sue, not yet, but to gather the truth and protect what was left. I walked home slower that day, each step measured as if the air itself had thickened. Autumn was nearly gone, and the leaves that once danced now carpeted the ground flat and dry. When I got home, I placed the letter in a new folder marked with a single word: truth. I slid it into the cabinet beside my chair, not to hide it, but to hold it until it was needed that night. I lit the fire for the first time since the reading of the will, not because it was cold, but because the silence asked for it. I sat on the floor with a cup of tea and let the crackle speak where words could not. The next morning, I called Elizabeth and asked if she still wanted to visit the mountains. She paused, then said, "Yes, if you're ready," I told her. I wasn't sure if I was, but I wanted to go anyway. "We set the date for 2 weeks from then before we hung up," she said. "You're not just fixing a house, Violet. You're rebuilding the part of yourself." They tried to silence. I didn't answer right away, just stared at the worn wood of the kitchen table, thought about all the hands that had rested there, and how mine still did as I hung up the phone. The light through the window caught the edges of the notebook again, still open to Howard's words. Protect the house. Protect her. And for the first time, I believed I was doing just that, under gray skies and early frost. Elizabeth and I made the trip to the cabin just 2 hours north, tucked between pines and a lake we used to visit when the children were small. It hadn't changed much. The shutters still needed painting, and the chimney leaned a little more than it should. But the view was the same, still and wide. We unpacked in silence. Not out of tension, just comfort. She put the kettle on while I opened windows. The scent of pine and wood smoke drifted in. I took the rocking chair on the porch and wrapped an old blanket around my legs. After lunch, she handed me a manila envelope she'd gotten from Arthur that morning. Inside were copies of financial records, emails, and a written statement from a former bank clerk named Matthew Bell. The name didn't mean anything to me at first until I read his affidavit. He'd once managed the account Calder used under Howard's name. Matthew admitted he'd been uneasy about the withdrawals, large and frequent, especially given how frail Howard looked. The one time they met, he said Calder had insisted everything was above board, even produced a notarized letter. But Matthew said Howard seemed confused, barely spoke, and didn't make eye contact. The clerk reported it at the time, but was overruled by his supervisor and eventually left the job. The letter Arthur had retrieved proved the signature wasn't Howard's. A handwriting analyst confirmed it. Now it was evidence of forgery and likely elder abuse. I sat with the folder in my lap for a long time, listening to the wind move through the trees. It wasn't rage that came over me, but a deep, clean ache, the kind that replaces shock once the truth has finally settled. That evening, we lit a fire in the hearth. Elizabeth read aloud from a book while I crocheted slowly without thought to pattern or color. Just the rhythm of hook and yarn outside. It began to snow lightly. The next morning, Arthur called. He'd filed for an emergency hearing based on the new evidence. The court date was set for 2 weeks from then, and Calder had been served. He'd responded through his lawyer, denying everything. Of course. Arthur warned it could get ugly, that Calder might accuse me of coercion, of being unfit or unstable. Anything to shift the spotlight. I told him. I understood that I was ready when we returned home. 2 days later, I found an envelope taped to the front door. No stamp. Just my name, written in rushed handwriting. Inside was a short note from Calder, asking to speak before the hearing. He said he didn't want this to tear the family apart. I didn't reply. Instead, I focused on the garden, pulling out dead stems and laying straw over the soil. Winter was coming, and the roots needed protecting, even if nothing would grow for a while. A week later, at the pre-hearing meeting, Calder arrived with a different lawyer. Younger, louder, but less prepared. Arthur presented the documents, the statement, the forged signature, the timeline of withdrawals, the bank records. It was enough that the judge scheduled a full evidentiary hearing afterward in the parking lot. Calder approached me, hands in his coat pockets, eyes darting. He asked if we could settle privately, said this was bad for both of us. He even had the nerve to say he never meant to hurt me. I looked at him for a long time. I thought of Howard, of his workshop, the worn stool by the garage door, of late-night laughter that no longer echoed in the house, and I said quietly, "You already did." Then I turned and walked back to my car. I didn't cry. Not then. The tears would come later, in the kitchen, while boiling water for tea. They'd fall quietly and without shame. Arthur called the next morning. Calder's lawyer had reached out with a proposed settlement. It included a full return of assets, an apology letter, and withdrawal from the will contest. Arthur said it was a strong offer, but the choice was mine. I said, I'd think about it. Then I went outside and stood beneath the maple tree where we'd buried Tucker, our old retriever. The leaves above were bare, the ground hard, but the sky was clear. Sometimes we don't get perfect justice, but we do get the chance to stop the harm, and that had to mean something. I walked back inside, ready to face what came next. The morning of the hearing arrived, cold and clear, with sunlight pouring over the yard and touching the frost along the old garden fence. I dressed quietly in the navy skirt suit I'd worn to Howard's retirement party years ago. It still fit, though. My reflection in the mirror looked a little older than the woman who'd once danced with him that night. Elizabeth drove me to the courthouse, her hand resting on my arm during the quiet parts of the ride inside the courtroom. Arthur sat beside me, his calm presence steadying, as Calder and his lawyer entered and took their seats. I watched Calder's eyes dart to the judge, to the folder of evidence, then finally to me. There was no anger in his face, just a weary resignation, as if he already knew how things would end. Arthur laid out the facts with quiet clarity. He read from the statements, he showed the forged documents, and the judge listened without interruption. When my turn came, I spoke slowly but clearly. I told the truth about Howard's last year, how I'd trusted my family, how I'd hoped, even at the end, that some part of what we built together would be safe. The judge listened closely. Her questions were fair, never sharp, and when she turned to Calder and asked him to respond, he did not deny the evidence. He only said softly that he'd made mistakes and wished things had been different. The decision was swift. The court returned full control of the estate to me and ordered Calder to pay restitution with supervision for any remaining family assets. There was no shouting, no drama, just a quiet finality, like the closing of a well-worn book. After the hearing, I stepped outside into the crisp air and let myself breathe for what felt like the first time in months. Elizabeth hugged me hard, and for a moment, neither of us said anything at all. It was over. The house would stay mine, at least for now, and the small summer place by the lake would go on holding its own memories, untouched by greed or anger. In the weeks that followed, I let the house settle back into itself. I donated a few things that belonged to Calder and Paisley, boxed up the rest, and left it at the foot of the stairs for a moving service to collect. I kept the silver frame with Calder's childhood photo by the window, even though the boy in that picture felt like a stranger to me. Now, Arthur visited once more to check in and say he was proud of how I'd handled things. I told him, thank you, but what mattered was not winning in court, but finding the strength to stand up for my own life, my own story. The first snowfall came early that year. I watched it fall from the warmth of the kitchen, my tea steaming in my hands, and thought of Howard, the way he'd always said the hardest winters could still end with spring. There's a lesson in all of this for anyone listening. Never let someone else decide your worth or write the ending to your story. No matter how late it feels, there is always time to reclaim your place and choose your own peace. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. If this story reminded you of your own resilience or a moment you had to stand up for yourself, I hope you'll share your thoughts below and subscribe for more stories that honor quiet strength and lasting hope.